Thank you for attending what is going to be the most exciting session, so you can congratulate yourselves at the back for having made the right choice. It's like Jaipur, you know. There are 5 sessions going on, and there are probably 3 Nobel laureates on 3 different sessions, and it's difficult to choose. So usually I go wherever William Dalrymple is sitting in. All right, I'm going to quickly introduce...
He just wants an invitation back next year.
I'm going to quickly introduce our 3 panelists and then move on from there. D.W. Gibson is the author of The Edge Becomes the Center, an oral history of gentrification in the 21st century. And Not Working. People talk about losing a job and finding their way in today's changing economy. I think of DW as my own private stud Sturkle. You know, he's great and has better sartorial style. So, all good.
High praise.
Gibson also serves as director of Writers OMI at Ledig House in Ghent, New York, and is the co-founder of Sangam House, is Arshia here? Writers Residency Program in India. Next, we have the wonderfully tattooed Ryan Gattis, who is the author of Kung Fu High School, The Big Drop, Homecoming and Impermanence, and the novel, All Involved, a novel of the 1992 LA riots. You should read the book, but if you haven't, you can wait for the HBO version that is, he's just signed the rights for, so all good. A lecturer at Chapman University and a member of LA Street Art Crew. He lives in Los Angeles. Last but most, Willie Dalrymple is the author of 9 books about... Actually, he writes so fast that since the time this was published, the brochure, he might have written 1 more. But at the time of publication, Dalrymple was the author of 9 books about India and the Islamic world, including City of Djinns, White Mughals, The Last Mughal, and 9 Lives in Search of the Sacred in Modern India. He recently curated a major show of late Mughal art for the Asia Society in New York called Princes and Painters in Mughal Delhi, 1707 to 1857. His new book, Return of a King, The Battle for Afghanistan, 1839 to 42, was published to acclaim in 2013. And recently he got the Kapuscinski Award, which, after Willie's sad death, will be named the Dalrymple Award because he is the one who has carried on that tradition of writing with flair and great engagement. What else? I'm told this is a panel on cities. To make it brisk, I said to Willie, I'll begin by asking, in which city of the world do you have the most girlfriends?
He actually said that.
And I said I would strangle you if you asked that.
So since this is my last appearance at any literary festival, let me ask all the questions I had dearly wanted to ask about cities. The first question was, you know, I've always believed that novels are about time. They're about time passing. So what about non-fiction? Non-fiction about cities. Are they about space? And is that how we should understand this? So I just thought, after all that frivolity, how about asking a serious question? Are you telling the story of space instead of time? Or, you know, primarily? So in any order. You want to start and move on? Or
I would say, in my case, yes, absolutely space. With the book that I just did, about gentrification, which is a problematic word in and of itself. And one of the reasons it's problematic is because it steers us toward this paradigm of thinking about space, about land, as a commodity, as strictly as a commodity, as property. So it was really interesting to talk to people who were thinking about land, who were thinking about space in other ways outside of an idea of how to commodify it, how to extract as much capital as you can out of it. So absolutely, I think it's about space, shared space, personal space, in the different communities we live in.
Ryan?
Well, since I wrote fiction,
Yes.
you know, I don't know if that
It
means
was
you want
about
me to
time and
pass.
space. No, I want you to answer it.
You know, I think in some ways, I do agree. You know, the novel is about time passing, but it's also about change within that character over time, or whichever characters we're following.
Yeah.
And in the case of writing All Involved, which was obviously about the 6 days of the LA riots, I found that because I had 17 different narrators, that the city really was the largest character, and because the face of the city changed so much in terms of space. We're talking about 11,000 fires. Completely changed the face of Los Angeles. And I spent time talking to firefighters, and they said, you know, one of the hardest things I've ever had to do in my life was have to look at this place burning. I was trained to put out the fire. Look at this place burning, I could only put that out. So it was almost, and the way that's changed moving forward for Los Angeles, I think in some ways it has created, you know, not to use, you know, a difficult term, but there's quite an age of gentrification going on in some of these areas that were actually burned during the riots. So I think in a way, you know, my book is about space as well.
Sure. Willie?
There are obviously many ways to write about a city. This huge living organism in front of you. You can dissect it vertically, horizontally. Urban history, sociology, geography. Some of the great city books are art history. Robert Hughes's Barcelona, Stones of Venice, Ruskin, Stones of Florence. The particular route I came to writing about Delhi, which is the city I've written most about, was through the lens of travel writing. And it's very interesting in the sense there are only two sorts of travel books, really. There's the sort of travel book where you go from A to B, which is most travel books. And then there's another kind of travel book when you don't go anywhere at all. You stay in one place. Mm-hmm. And you write about a city. And there are some wonderful books of travel books about cities. Jan Morris's book on Venice, which has thousands of little chapters. It's like a collection of essays. The best one is a two-pager on Venetian cats. And it's just wonderfully sort of off-the-wall bit of bravura writing. But trying to write about Delhi, very much the way I saw Delhi, and what intrigued me about Delhi was its historical layering. It has this extraordinary chronology. And unlike any other city I knew, it had this strange thing of being built, destroyed, rebuilt, always somewhere slightly different. So if you go to Delhi today, there's the first of Delhi of which there's any trace. There's a legendary Delhi of the Mahabharata, Indraprastha, which is said to lie under Puranikila, but there's no visible trace. But the first city of which there is clear archaeological and solid evidence today is Lal Kot, which was built by Prithviraj Chauhan in the 11th century. And then more or less every century after that, that's been destroyed, and then another one has been built. Jahanpanna, Tughlaqabad, Feroz Shah Kotla, Shah Jahanabad, and then the British built New Delhi, and then it started going backwards, southwards again, having gone slowly northwards. And I was fascinated by the way that this city, which had so many, I mean, you could look at it in terms of space, you could go around it in terms of geography, but you could also go down it or peel it like an onion. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And that was what I chose to do in City of Djinns, to do in a sense the onion approach, and to look first at modern Delhi, then go back to Shah Jahanabad, then to the Twilight, then to the medieval Tughlaq period, and then eventually end up at Indraprastha. But I also had the kind of forward motor of a diary of a year. So there was a nominal 1 year in Delhi that was in fact my conflated diaries of 4 years in the place. And so, in sort of January I'd be looking at New Delhi, and then go slowly backwards until the monsoon broke. And it's probably the most complicated structure I've ever had for any book, but it was rather fun trying to make it work, and the difficulty being how to go backwards chronologically without sort of falling over yourself. Mm-hmm. And it was an interesting exercise in how to write. But it is a problem, because unlike a journey where there is a beginning and an end, and you start one place and you end the other, a city you can do a million ways. My friend Sam Miller, who also wrote did a sort of like an ammonite or a spiral. He went further and went in circles round to the geographical centre, ending up in Connaught Place. And that's one of the difficulties about writing about cities, is they are such huge organisms existing at so many levels, and both sort of spatially and in time and in space. They are three-dimensional organisms that you can penetrate from a whole variety of different ways. And everyone does it differently.
Yeah.
There is no clear template for the city book.
You know, one of the things that writers find annoying is when they're asked, where do you get your ideas from? And another question that might not be as annoying, but is very persistent, is when people are asked, who are you influenced by? So here I want to give it a little different spin and ask, you know, William just mentioned Jan Morris's book on Venice. I want to ask our panelists, can you name one book that has influenced you or you think you might be in communication with? So he's already mentioned Jan Morris, but we'll go back to him. Can you mention one other book about a city that, and keep it in nonfiction because I'll come back to ask you about fiction also, but if another book, nonfiction about city.
Funny thing is, the book about city that comes to mind first is actually Hunger.
Knut Hansen's?
Yeah,
oh.
that sense of Christiania and that landscape that he was talking about. But the first book that came to mind actually wasn't city-oriented, strictly speaking, place-oriented, though. Joan Didion, Where I Was From, more broadly about California. And she definitely zeroes in on certain California landscapes. But that's a very important book for me. And I feel like I'm hopefully in dialogue with something along those lines.
I teach a course called Writing About the City, so I'm hoping to expand my syllabus. Use this time usefully. All right, man, Ryan.
You know, initially I was going to say The Killing Season by Miles Corwin, which is an absolutely brilliant piece about an LA Times reporter embedding himself with a Compton detective unit I think in '94, and just the horrors that he sees and just the lack of funding that they had to deal with. But I think, honestly, it's a very recent book, also nonfiction, is Ghetto Side by Jill Leovy, also an LA Times reporter, also about Los Angeles. But, you know, she talks about Watts in 2008, 2009. And she tells a tremendous story about crime in America, in particular homicide, how it affects African Americans. But she weds an extremely cogent social analysis of incredibly big picture stuff that we'll see snatches of in the media, but she puts it all together and she weds that to a thriller. Mm-hmm. So she tells the true story of what happened when a detective who lived in Watts, when his son was murdered. And she takes it from the police finding out who did it to taking it to trial. And it's just absolutely brilliant. And I felt in many ways the echoes between my own novel and her work. And I found myself writing true next to some of these pieces because, you know, she talks about the early 90s a lot in the book, and she calls it the monster because it was a time of tremendous violence in Los Angeles. Over 3,000 people were murdered in Los Angeles in 1992. And so she talks about the monster, which is what I wrote about. And then she talks about how the city has changed in a slightly different part of South Central. And that one, although a recent book, is very close to my heart.
Cool. William?
A book which hasn't influenced me in a sense because it came after my book, but a book which I hugely admire and am most envious of any of my contemporaries' books is Suketu Mehta's book on Bombay, Maximum City. It's a huge book in every sense. It's an enormous book. There's a probably apocryphal story of his publisher, Sunny Mehta, taking him out to lunch when Suketu had just delivered yet another tranche of this manuscript. He'd been at it 10 years at this point. And Sunny took him to a particularly good restaurant, sat him down, and said, Suketu, order whatever you like. And he ordered, take the best champagne. Getting a bit suspicious. Is your champagne good? It is, he said. Suketu, promise me you will not write one more fucking word of that book. and he was good to his promise. And he then spent another 3 years boiling that down and producing the essence of Bombay, which is what it is. And it's a book of hugely concentrated brilliance. I read it first time in proof straight through, but since then I've gone back to it. Whenever I've had something which has touched on Bombay, or indeed any of the subjects he deals with. For example, there's a small section in it but a brilliant section on Jains,
Sure.
on the rich Jain merchants who are also often give up all their wealth and then go off and live this incredibly ascetic lifestyle. And when I was writing about a Jain nun myself, I went back to that passage. And although it's only about 10 pages in a 500-page book, it's by far the best thing anyone that I've read has written about the Jains. And it has that quality of concentrated brilliance when you know a person has really, really, really worked on a piece of prose and taken it back and rewritten it and cut it down a bit more and then just produced this, made it into a tauter. I think there is something about non-fiction writing of that sort which it resembles someone like a kind of master like Michelangelo with a block of stone. And you just chip away at it and polish it and go back to it and never quite leave it alone until it is this very finished thing. And no one of my friends from my generation of writers, I think, has produced such a perfect book of non-fiction as that.
If I could piggyback on that, I think he's doing the same for New York now.
Yeah,
I know he's taking
right.
a long time, and I'm excited for that book.
It's over 10 years now.
Exactly.
He needs to be taken out for another lunch, expensive lunch. Yeah.
But speaking so much about LA, a writer that really brings that city to life for me on the fiction side is John Fante and Ask the Dust. And I just really get immersed in that city when I read John Fante. Another book that
City of Quartz, too?
What's
City of Quartz, isn't that an LA classic?
That's non-fiction. I believe.
Non-fiction, yeah.
But also, when you mentioned Suketu, also reminded me of Francisco Goldman, who writes so well about Mexico City in the interior circuit, a fantastic, sprawling book about that city.
You know,
It's interesting, though, just
go ahead.
how there are some cities which attract certain art forms. And Bombay, in the Indian context, Bombay is obviously the city of film. And it's the background to so many great Bollywood and other films about India. But Delhi seems to be increasingly one that seems to be attracting writers in our generation to write about it. Very good one last year by Rana Dasgupta, Capital, about the new Delhi, this world of the new rich, these sort of mafiosi living on farms in the south and talking to the migrant workers and everything. And LA seems to be another of these cities that just keeps attracting writers. And there are the whole piles of books on so certain cities just seem to produce libraries and other ones remain unwritten.
what would be the art form for Boulder? A mantra. Om. Yeah. Listen, I wanted to ask you another question. People like Walter Benjamin writing about cities made you conscious that cities produce new experience. So, for example, till lighting was discovered, people had not discovered the joys of the night, right? So a lit street at night produced a whole new literature of the London night, for example. And it was the same with boulevards in Paris. I think it was Benjamin who once describes how till industrialization came and workers started being taken in trains to cities to work, they had never sat with a stranger, face to face with a stranger for this length of time. Proximity was only with neighbors, etc. So I wanted to ask you if each one of you could speak a little bit about what sort of new experience did you approach in writing about the city that you were writing your books about?
Well, I think about those crosshairs you were talking about, William, in different ways to sort of think about this living organism. And I've lived in New York, I moved to New York 20 years ago and seen a lot of change in the city and developed a lot of ideas about the city in that span of time. And so for me, it was very exciting to go out. It's, for me, one of those cross sections is perspective and interacting with people that are approaching the city in a very, very different way than I am. And sitting down and talking to them for a couple of hours or a couple of days to see how they see the city. It totally reinvents it for me. So the most exciting thing for me is those encounters, people that are approaching it geographically from a neighborhood that I've never been to. And New York is this very finite area. It's not like LA, this sort of sprawling basin that we continue to define in broader and broader terms. It's 5 boroughs, the geography is certain, but still all of those nooks and crannies, some neighborhoods hadn't gone to before working on this book. So
give an example.
Some of the farthest reaches of Brooklyn, East New York, Bensonhurst, Throgs Neck in the Bronx, neighborhoods that I never lived in or worked in, that had immigrant communities or African-American communities that were just foreign to me. Yeah. And so spending time in those places, being immersed in those places and seeing the city from that perspective. And it also makes you think, wow, how many millions and millions of people come and experience this city, in a 3-block radius, yeah. From Times Square, and that makes you very sad.
Just building off of that, I think, in terms of city creating an experience. I'm from Colorado originally. I'm from Colorado Springs. I come from an Air Force family. My understanding of Los Angeles, perhaps similar to Bombay, is it's a city of film. I'd seen it in movies. I'd seen it on television. But then to go there, to live on 5th and Main, to eventually join a street art crew where a lot of our mission was to go to some of the poorest places, to go to some of these neighborhoods that were heavily gang involved and actually paint, change the face of them, make them better. Taught me a tremendous amount. And I couldn't agree more about being able to talk to people with different worldviews and immigrant backgrounds. I mean, that was extremely moving, but also eye-opening to me. And that eventually led into my nearly 2.5 years of talking with former Latino gang members about Linwood, which is in many ways a forgotten city. It's right next to Compton. Many of the problems that we associate with Compton have always been Linwood's, but people are more familiar with Compton because of hip-hop, NWA, straight out of Compton. And yet, it was fascinating to spend time with the people, and maybe this kind of connects to the notion of space as well. When I'd asked them about 1992, the thing they remembered most initially was not the riots. Mm-hmm. It was a freeway being built, the 105 freeway, which is an elevated freeway, which in many ways signifies how Angelenos drive over some of the most suspect areas of the city, like Inglewood, like Compton, like Linwood, and some of how the government went about taking houses and space to do that was a bit suspect. But I had to find a way to weave that into the book as well. And I think there's a moment where an addict has actually driven his car up onto an unfinished freeway ramp so he can actually get perspective. Because again, LA is this incredibly broad city. There are very few moments when you can get a perspective or see the lay of the land. Yeah, absolutely.
My sense of LA is also the freeway, of O.J. Simpson going on the freeway in that SUV. Sure. Mr. Dalrymple.
One of the interesting things about writing a book about a city that you have lived in for a long time is having to go and investigate the bits the less seamy bits. Inevitably, when you move to a city and take an interest in it, you go to the lovely things. You go to the tourist sites. You go to the historic places, whatever the kind of centers of interest are. But when you're writing about a city, you often have to dive into the entrails and the depths and interview and discover parts of the city which you've known about and groups within a city which you've known about but which you've maybe avoided or not needed to interact with. And the most difficult bit of writing about Delhi, and the bit that nearly stumped me completely, was writing about the Hijras, the eunuch community. And anyone that's been to India even for a short time knows that these guys sometimes beg at the lights, sometimes lounge around getting money in the Lodi Gardens, but also have this sort of amazing intelligence network. So when a baby is born, they will turn up and give a blessing to the baby in return for some bakshish, or will turn up at a wedding and dance, or even threaten to strip off their clothes and expose themselves if you don't pay them to go away. And I found it very difficult to penetrate this world. I went up to a few of them and tried to get into conversation, but any questions were soon brushed off. And eventually found a way in through, there was a jeweler who used to make them jewelry, who was very close to them, called Zakir. And he led me into that. And the extraordinary counterworld of which I had not really the slightest conception, but with its own history, as so much in Delhi, a confluence of two different traditions, one Hindu, one Muslim. The Muslim tradition of eunuchs as harem guards and harem custodians. The Hindu tradition of sort of transsexuals who dance for a living, like Arjuna had to pretend to be in the Mahabharata, goes right back to ancient Puranic times. And they live in brotherhoods. They look after each other. There's a great deal of sort of back-watching, and it was fascinating because these were going on in places, parts of the city I knew quite well. Tukman Gate was the area I was going to in the old city, which is full of historic stuff, and I spent a lot of time investigating that area, but had no idea of this hidden world within a world. And that, in a sense, for me, was the great pleasure of doing this book, is that forces you to investigate the bits of the cities that you hadn't wanted to, or hadn't had time to, hadn't had the courage to, hadn't had the motivation to. And in the process, as is always the nature of the cities, there are these brotherhoods or groups or immigrant communities or whatever they are that are their own little enclosed networks, which you don't necessarily come across unless you make an effort to go out and seek them out and put them on the page.
V.S. Naipaul has said that the story of places can only be told by telling the stories of people. I was writing about my own hometown, and I thought instead of people, I should write about rats, because rats had carried away my mother's dentures. I don't know whether Marie Brenner's in the audience, but our mutual friend Lawrence Wright always says that your stories need a mule. And he often talks about a character being that mule. But I was wondering if you guys could talk a little bit about who were your rats, what have you found most convenient to be those, indefatigable carriers of the weight of your narrative?
I've got a straight answer there.
Yes, please, go ahead.
Yeah, in City of Djinns, there was this amazing man who was my mule, and as well as the mule driver, and indeed the guide. He was a whole one-man sort of pioneer unit. And he was this wonderful, wonderful figure, an inexhaustible seam of stories of the sort that a writer hopes to turn up, and very much a symbol of the sort of lost Delhi which I was writing about. Was this character, Dr. Jaffrey. And I should explain to those of you who don't know Delhi or don't know Indian history that Delhi is an odd city because it has been for centuries the center of the whole Indo-Islamic chapter of India's history, since 1192 right through to 1857 when the British crushed the Mughal dynasty. Delhi has been the center of rule for North India and often most of India for a succession of Muslim empires. And as Indo-Islamic joint civilization grew up, with bringing together the civilization of India and the civilization of Central Asia and the Middle East, Delhi becoming the crucible where, in terms of music, in terms of language, in terms of architectural style, in a whole variety of ways, in terms of poetic style, Delhi was the place where these two worlds met and mixed and fused in a genuinely mixed way throughout history. And became, in time, having started in the 12th or 13th century very much as a frontier town on the edge of an Islamic conquest, became by the 16th and 17th century the center of Islamic culture. And the place everyone looked to, for example, in the same way that everyone in Italy looks to Florence and Tuscany for the finest Italian. So in India, people would look to Shahjahanabad as the center of Urdu and Hindustani, the most refined manners, the adab of the Mughal court, how to pass a pan, how to crack a joke in civilized society. This Ghalib, the world of the Mughal court, this incredible refinement of Mughal cultural interplay, the famous mushairas of Delhi, which were like a cross between a lit fest and a sort of crossword competition or Sudoku, where a bunch of poets would gather and they would be told by about 9 or 10 in the morning the meter of the rhyme form which would be set for the evening's thing. And they would have presumably to mug up on their rhymes and rhyme schemes in time to that. And then there would be this sort of poetic dialogue that would go competitively around the room, and a couplet would be made by one poet, which would end with a slight dig at the next poet, who would then have to throw it back like a game of ping pong or something. And it was a highly refined poetic world, and yet when I arrived in Delhi in 1984, the world I saw in front of me was a very different one from this. At partition, the old Indo-Islamic elite, many of them went to Pakistan. In return, tens of thousands of displaced Hindu and Sikh refugees from what had been Pakistan arrived in Delhi as refugees on the back of bullock carts, often starving, often with a deep dislike and often with very good reason, due to the massacres of partition, had an intense hatred of the kind of Islamic culture which Delhi represented. So it was as if in London terms, it was as if the poets and writers of Bloomsbury had been turfed out, and a bunch of sort of mud-booted Yorkshire farmers had come and sort of sat in their place. And Delhi today was renowned, far from being the centre of etiquette and high culture, as being the sort of place where boorish, high-spirited, partying, heavy-drinking, whiskey-loving Punjabis would be having elaborate weddings. But there was very little sort of deep poetic refinement. And as an outsider coming into this world, it was trying to sort of, why is this city, which is meant to be this great centre of civilizations, so fabulously boorish today? And trying to work that out. To come back to the question, that my way in was this wonderful man, Dr. Jaffrey, who was this old Persian teacher, the son and grandson and great-grandson of Persian teachers in the Red Fort, who was this sort of the last man, really, alive, who really did that old poetic culture and knew every stone of the city. And walking, as I did for months with him around the old city, he would not only say, that's Turkman Gate, where somebody shot an arrow at the Emperor Akbar when he entered the city, but he would also say, in that cubbyhole over there, you'll find one of the last calligraphers who can still do the old cursive Shikasta script, and over there there's a kind of great grandson of the Sufi who came from Bukhara in 1251, and the stories would just roll out, and really, I mean, it's his book. It's he was more than a mule. He was a thoroughbred stallion.
Right.
Well, it's interesting, I think, because as a writer of fiction, I found being an outsider in Los Angeles, the weight was absolutely upon me. The responsibility was upon me to make sure I did the research. And, William was talking about these closed communities, and that's, I think, a really perfect encapsulation for what Latino gang subculture is in Los Angeles. I mean, apart from the writings of maybe Luis J. Rodriguez and Chris Blatchford, we know almost nothing about how those gangs actually operate. By contrast, we know a tremendous amount about how some of the African-American gangs operated around that time because of memoirs like Monster. So, I actually found myself, after I had been speaking to former gang members for about 4 months, I found myself summoned to Linwood to meet with a relatively high-ranking former gang member. I took a bus. I stashed my real phone in my sock. I had a fake phone in my pocket, and I went down. Oh my gosh, I was ready. I was prepared. I thought I was so smart, and then I got basically pulled up in front of this guy, and he wouldn't talk to me unless I gave him my phone. And so I had to make a decision, do I give him my fake phone or my real phone? And I just remember as I was reaching down to grab it, he starts laughing at me. And he says, that's the first place they'd look. And what happened after that was this tremendous interrogation. He wanted to know who I was, what I wanted, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Fully aware of the fact, of course, that pretty much no one has written nonfiction about this world. And the reason why he was even sitting down with me was because I said, I do not want to write nonfiction about this world. I want to write fiction. But I also noticed that he had a scar on his head.
Was he very au fait with the distinction? I mean, he got the difference?
The distinction in terms of...
Fiction and non-fiction.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. I think he was far more open to that. Whereas if I had said nonfiction, that meeting never would have taken place. But I noticed that he had this scar, and I thought, I have to tell him, the story of what happened to me when I was 17. And it's that I was hit so hard in the face that it tore my nose out. I had 2 facial reconstructive surgeries. It took me about a year before I could smell and taste again. And sharing that with him actually moved him, like brought him forward, literally in his chair. And it broke his barriers down, and he started asking me, what did you go through? What were the surgeries like? He had all these questions. He was fluent in the language of pain. And I think in just this brief moment, we managed to connect on a human level. But I think that was also the thing that really gave him insight into how I would write the book. Yes, it would be violent. The 1992 riots were incredibly violent. In fact, when I was writing mostly about crimes of opportunity that happened outside active rioting sites. But I think story, oddly enough, was what convinced him to allow me to keep talking to people. And he, in some ways, as well as a number of others directly after, became my guides.
Great. Thank you. DW, take a shot at that, man.
I don't know that I have just one rat, and I don't know if I could call them rats, but because I'm looking. So I have a subject I want to talk to people about. So I'm actually looking for a lot of vessels, a lot of people to help me sort of curate a conversation. It's sort of spread evenly throughout. For me, the important thing is sort of what you just touched on, connecting with them, putting them at ease so we can really open up in a timely fashion. And that often just involves proving that one way or another that I'm a moron at the beginning of the conversation, putting them at ease,
That is usually the role of the moderator at Jaipur Literature Festival. But I must tell you, we have 5 minutes left. I must tell you that once I was in a conversation with Hanif Qureshi on the stage at Jaipur, and we had a nice conversation, I thought, and then we said we'll open the floor, to questions, and which we are going to do in 3 minutes now. And we did this at Jaipur, and the first question was, Mr. Qureshi, are you circumcised? He said, it's been a long time since anyone took any interest in my genitalia.
Brilliant answer.
Brilliant answer. Wow. The gentleman was asking this question because his grandson had been circumcised recently, and he was, how shall I put it, to borrow a phrase from Ryan, he was fluent in the language of pain. My last question is, and you have to give quick answers, gentlemen, is name one cliche about writing about cities. How cities are written about, a commonplace that, you find inadequate or far too ordinary or far too banal or far too common.
That's a hard one.
I think I shouldn't have said there's only a few minutes left. I should have said we have an hour left. I'll just ask you this question.
There's no sense of, I don't know if it's cliche. I don't know. There are a lot of cliches. I'm thinking specifically about New York, but so I think maybe maybe one cliche is there's cities are that sort of place of opportunity. That plays out, but it also doesn't play out at all for a lot of people who come seeking that cliche or that truth. They hope that truth. So I think that's sort of I'll say a theme that plays out problematically, and yeah.
Yep.
I'm going to steal DW's answer, mainly because I found cities as a place of survival, at least as I was writing about them. That was, although a promise had been made and not necessarily kept, survival was by far the most important thing.
The lovely cliche, which is always said about Delhi, I don't know why it particularly attracts it, but on the back of 9 out of 10 books on Delhi, City of Contrasts.
That's right.
And I've developed this sort of itch now whenever I see that written again. But it is, funny enough, it is kind of true, though. What's interesting about Delhi is it does have this sort of fantastic spread, both in terms of time. It is that sort of incredibly ancient city where, like Rome or Cairo or Istanbul, wherever you go, the past sort of groans out at you with old tombs sitting on the middle of roundabouts or in the middle of the golf course, or madrasas popping up in the middle of housing developments, and the ruins of ages scattered around the city in the way that it is with ancient capitals. Rome is the same. You can't build a straight road in Rome. The whole of the Rome, straight roads go to Rome from all over the Roman Empire, but once you get there, you can't build a straight road because there's so much old stuff lying around everywhere. also these fantastic extremes of wealth. It is the place that attracts the migrant labourers in their shanty counter cities, in these vast cities which get thrown out further and further away from the centre by the government to try and hide them, but just keep expanding outwards from there. And it is now, one of the kind of great extraordinary stories, the untold story about Delhi, is that it is now almost the biggest city on earth. It's not officially, because Delhi is split between Delhi state, which is what the figure is normally given as, which is about 5 or 6 million people, but it only now encompasses about 1/10 of the urban area, which has spread out massively into Haryana with the growth of Gurgaon and Faridabad and UP with Noida. And if you look at Delhi from space, it is the second largest urban area in the world after Greater Tokyo, and has 26 million people in an extended urban belt. So it's sort of a city of mega contrasts, really.
My favorite deconstruction of cliche about a city appears in a park in New York. Inscribed there are the words of a working-class Italian immigrant. It says, "When I came to America, I was told the cities were paved with gold. I found out that not only were they not paved with gold, they were not paved at all, and I had to do the digging." So I thought that was great. All right, time is ripe now for audience questions. Sir.
Why has nobody brought up the most brilliant, delicious city novel, 1980s New York City, Bonfire of the Vanities?
And you have 1 minute to respond.
No, sir, I'm not circumcised.
Do we have just 1 minute for the entire audience questions? Oh, I thought you said 10 minutes. Okay.
Well, to that I'll say thank you for mentioning it. It's in the conversation, Bonfire of the Vanities, 1980s New York.
On that note.
There's space and time for authors to sign their books downstairs, and please come and ask questions or share thoughts that you had. I'm sorry that we didn't have more time. I didn't understand that.
Well, it's time for one more.
Okay, sure. One more? Who are you pointing? Please.
Okay, so Bonfire of the Vanities is an example. It's this very specific portrait of New York at this very specific time. Do you feel like when you're writing about your city that you're sort of fighting all of these previous snapshots that were taken by other authors?
I don't think so, because it's that as you just said, it was a snapshot in a specific time, and so like the neighborhoods I was focused on while I was interviewing people, the real estate market and the headlines have already moved past them, and I just published the book months ago. So this is fluid, and I think that you're always finding a different time and space.
I mean, as far as the riots are concerned, it absolutely was the snapshot of that specific time. But I think the beauty of what I went in search of, it's the hidden. It's an LA that we haven't seen in film and television. Linwood has almost never been written about or filmed. I think for me, I found freedom in that. And as a result, I didn't feel as if I was fighting against what had come before.
I was lucky in that there hadn't been a Delhi book for about 100 years. But there are some terribly good old ones. And since then, there have been 5 or 6 really good ones. Most recently, Rana Dasgupta. But I had lunch with Stacey Schiff on Friday in New York, and she said that she'd had this problem when she was writing. She wrote 2 books successfully, which had enormous piles of predecessors. She wrote a biography of Cleopatra, and there were something like 200 other biographies of Cleopatra, and then she'd written one on Johnson, and there had been 200 other books on Johnson. And she said she just didn't read any of the secondary books. To avoid getting infected by them, she just stuck to the primary sources and did her own things, which is a drastic and brave solution, but I'm sure a good one.
Please join me in thanking our panelists.